Amen. Very good. Are you really with your okay. Maybe you're. He's doing good. He's getting very cute. Good morning.
Oh, well, Peter never replied, I didn't know, but just me?
I think so.
Or myself? Okay.
I can bring a camera in. You can just stay. I'll do it right in class.
Okay, that sounds great.
We're going to go ahead and get started because we have too good of information to wait any longer. It's my pleasure to introduce Doug Ottati. Doug is, he's got a fancy title, but he's a professor of Reformed theology at the college. Also in the back is Matt Sampson. He's co-teaching. Matt is professor of is it anthropology? Okay, I'm excited I can pull that out. Also at the college. Matt is also a Presbyterian pastor. There are handouts, and I'm gonna let Doug go. Welcome everybody on YouTube and Zoom. All right.
Okay, so I'm pleased to be here. We got a few things we'd like to get through, but we won't go through all of it in great detail. The idea of the series is to introduce Reformed tradition in its diversity and then also some of its origins. Reformed tradition is the branch of Protestantism of which Presbyterian is a part. So if you are a Presbyterian, you are a branch of Western Christendom, which is itself a branch of Eastern Orthodoxy. And then you are a branch of Protestantism. And then you are a branch of Reformed tradition. I'm trying to think how many branches that makes, but I think it makes on the order of a branch of a branch of a branch. That would ordinarily be, I think, in common English language, a twig is what you're remembering. If you're thinking that being Presbyterian is a little odd, that's because it is. It is a minority report within Christianity, and it also involves a distinctive voice. We're going to try and talk over a little bit how it got the way it got. You can see in terms of the series as a whole that we're going to do a couple of things. Today is the beginning of it. So we're talking about how Reformed tradition starts out, and then some of the things that we learned early on. Next time, David True is going to talk about confessing Christ in Nazi Germany. He'll focus on the Belhar Confession, which is an important document in that particular period. You want to know that not all Protestants and not all Reformed Protestants were anti-Nazi. Don't worry about that. There's everything from soup to nuts in history, but some of them were. And some of them are put together this thing called the Belhar Confession, and he'll talk about that. The Bar Declaration. He'll talk about that. The next time, Matt Sampson, who's back here, will talk about Reformed Christianity in the global South and Latin America. Among other things, he'll talk about the Prague Confession of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. which is the confession that's being featured in worship today. And then I'll finish up with something on reforming apartheid and some signatures for worldwide movement. Reforming apartheid will have to do with the Belhar Confession in South Africa from the 1980s, which is, among other things, a document that is implicitly critical of apartheid and has to do with certain current events and movements. So that's what we'll do. Now, when we do that, you want to know that we're just scratching the surface of a worldwide movement. Today, there are Reformed churches in approximately 190 churches in 100 countries, something like that. That number fluctuates a little bit, not always because it's getting bigger. Sometimes it fluctuates because churches split, right, and then they count as two. So it's a pretty big deal, and it's all over the place. But we will try and give a kind of sampling of that sort of stuff here. In any case, what we're talking about today is the 16th century. So you just want to sort of think back a little bit before when anyone was here, and we'll start talking about how this movement starts up. In the 16th century, John Calvin at Geneva is an important figure for the Reform movement. It's decisive, more or less. Even so, the origins of the movement are multiple and they're intertwined with diverse linguistic, cultural, and political contexts. I'll give you just some examples. Wurlis Zwingli, who started in this movement earlier than Calvin did, was in Zurich. He died on the field of battle incidentally because the Reformation was a root 'em up, shoot 'em up period of time, and religious reform and political reform were very closely intertwined, as we shall see. Zurich is an independent city-state in the Swiss Confederation, and he is fighting with some other groups at the time. He's in battle and gets killed. He's about 31 or so. He died on October 11, 1531. I thought I'd put that in there because tomorrow is the 490th anniversary of his death. So that's a reformer, an important reformed reformer, someone in the line of Calvin, also active in Switzerland. There are others. Heinrich Bullinger was also in Zurich. There were people at Strasbourg, Cambridge, and then Zacharias Ursinus. Some of you may have heard of Ursinus College in Pennsylvania. It's named after him. I mean, how many people can be named that? And he's active also in the Palatinate, where a certain confession was put together and so forth, and a theologian. By the end of the 16th century, there are Reformed churches in Switzerland, Germany, France, Holland, Scotland, England, and Poland, and elsewhere. So by the end of that century, it's pretty much a European-wide movement. Now, we might say that's not going too far by American standards. It's not like going all the way to California or something like that. But you do want to understand this is before planes, trains, and automobiles. You also want to understand that every time you go a few hundred miles, you cross a cultural and linguistic border. And so you can't depend on the same language being spoken and so on and so forth. So that's not bad coverage for really. What holds the movement together? It never has a pope. It never has a central organization. It has a series, a network of educational institutions. They're in Geneva, Edinburgh, Heidelberg, elsewhere in Europe, and they keep writing stuff and exchanging stuff. And that's more or less what holds it together. So it's comparatively loosely wound for a movement. No central authority pronouncing on exactly what is reformed. This does not exist. It never has. It is also something that takes place in a variety of different linguistic contexts and so forth, as we said. And it's a little different from Lutheranism that way. Lutheranism focused on a single figure, Martin Luther, with confessions written over a particular period of time, period of about 100 years or so, maybe less really, in a particular part of Europe. That's not true here. You're going to have confessions show up from different places: Scotland, England, Switzerland, Geneva, Hungary, things like that. So there are some, you want to see that there are multiple figures in multiple centers in various contexts. There are some commonalities to the movement, an emphasis on the priority of Scripture or God's Word over church teaching. The idea is that church teaching can get it wrong, criticize it by going to biblical study, something along those lines. You can criticize it by going to the original sources of the movement. This is a Protestant idea, but it's also a humanist idea. That is, this is the period of time where humanist scholars are developing critical editions of classical texts like Homer, right? And like philosophers and so on and so forth. And when the reformers show up and say they want critical editions of the Bible, it's basically a humanist move. They want the original languages and they want to be able to study those and they want critical editions. So Protestantism here with the Reformation all overlaps a bit with humanism in that respect. There are also some other commonalities. There are differences. Zwingli in Zurich understands the Lord's Supper differently than Calvin did. There are exiled English and Scottish reformers studying in Geneva with Calvin, and they issue explicit calls for revolution. John Knox, Christopher Goodman, but you can understand that. Knox ran a revolution in Scotland, political revolution, and Goodman was part of a failed Puritan attempt, right, to run a revolution in England after a while. That's what you get there. Calvin himself has a number of things to say about politics. We'll talk about that, but they are more like the Huguenots in France when it comes to the question of revolution, who also issue explicit calls for political revolution. Your part, if you're in this tradition of a tradition that's been involved in multiple political revolutions in this country, France, and elsewhere, it's one of the markers of the movement. And that's in part because of the way it begins. Okay, by the beginning of the 17th century, there are controversies between different reform groups in Holland. There are reform sympathizers in England who are driving a wide-ranging Puritan movement in the Anglican Church and also beyond it. You know, if you go to London and you're there, where you've got all the great all the great English buried, going around there in Westminster. At a certain point, if you're looking at one king, you're standing on a stone to mark Oliver Cromwell, who's not well thought of these days. He's a Puritan, and he was running a revolution, trying to get rid of a monarch, trying to have representative stuff, very typical stuff. So next time you're there, watch where you're standing. You might be standing on Oliver Cromwell's marker. As I say, that's an indicator of how his stock has fallen off. People don't like it. Some people. So we have the Puritan movement. Puritans are also in New England. There they mix with Baptists and Levelers. Levelers want to say that everyone's equal in a church. One of the big things here is they're against bishops. They're against hierarchies. Roger Williams in Rhode Island. Next time you're in Rhode Island, pull in, stop while you're there, just pat the ground. This is the original guy who cares about separation of church and state and limitation of government power with respect to religious conviction. And he does it for religious reasons. He's not a secularist, he's a Reformed theologian. What's on his mind? What's on his mind is he thinks that coerced religious faith is not true religious faith. If it's required, it's not really yours. That's one. And second, he doesn't trust the government to regulate stuff. Why? Because sin is radical and universal. And if it's true that people make mistakes, so do people in government make mistakes, so you don't let them do it. And he has the notion that the only thing the government ought to regulate are beliefs that lead to external harm to other people. That's Roger Williams, and it's out of the same family of thinkers and groups. The Westminster Confession, which is one of the basic confessions of Presbyterianism, was written in 1647 in the middle of the Civil War. So by the time you get to the end of the 17th century, you have what we could call multiple Reformed churches, or if you like, multiple Calvinisms, except the trouble with the word Calvinisms is that they're not all completely beholden to Calvin, if that makes any sense. There's a group at the beginning. Today, it's a worldwide movement in a whole bunch of places. There are all sorts of issues that are being faced. will turn out by the late 17th century, Dutch Reformed and French Huguenot settlers immigrate to South Africa. There you get Afrikaner Calvinism, which is bound up with apartheid. You also get a free church tradition. A free church tradition is one that thinks you should be separate from the government. That's what the free part means. And you also get in South Africa after a while, maybe 1981, the Alliance of Black Reformed Christians in South Africa. So a number of developments there. I'm just going to skip over stuff in this country because we're here, but there's a lot of stuff. You may know that you're part of the Presbyterian. If you're going to church here, you're worshiping in a congregation of Presbyterian Church USA. That is the successor to a whole series of denominations that incorporated other Presbyterian groups. Presbyterians have never been all that united, and don't worry about that. And one of the ways you can tell, so go back there a little bit, the Northern Church is called the United Presbyterian Church. The United part meant that it was the combination of about 4 or 5 different Presbyterian churches in the country. But not everyone in all the 4 or 5 churches threw in. Never happens. And some of them, particularly South Carolina and here, remain independent of that. And then there's other splits later. So there's a bunch of different Presbyterians hanging around this country. We're not going to talk about that. We do get developments in South Africa. Reform ministers today in Pacific countries, such as the Cook Islands and Guinea and so forth, are asking about appropriate hymns, dancing, architecture, and so forth. They're trying to encourage more indigenous forms of worship in those areas. And they want to, the question is, how do you do that? If you just cave in to everything a culture wants to do, are you saying anything in particular anymore? I mean, look, if you want to, we could just have a Panthers game here, but that really wouldn't be Reformed Christianity. It would be football, maybe good football, maybe not, depending on the year. That's up to you, but it wouldn't be Reformed Christianity. So you all got a little problem when you go into a different context. You want to be responsive to it and ask how you can work with indigenous forms. You also want to be careful not simply to reproduce what's already there culturally and bring no particular message. Okay, it's a real simple point. In this country around here, what would you worry about? You worry about suburban American culture and the way it's set up, and whether or not it's simply overrunning certain Protestant traditions in favor of certain preferences. But in the Cook Islands, you worry about other things. There is an ecumenical Christian witness in the Middle East. You can understand that as a distinct minority and Reformed churches there. They're interested in ecumenical witness together with other Christian groups. There are Reformed churches in India who endorse secular values. By that, they don't mean the end of religion. They mean they don't want Hinduism to dominate everything as a nationalist enterprise. That's what they mean. There are more Presbyterians in Korea than there are in Scotland today, and that's been true for a long time. Korean Presbyterian churches are active in the United States and Brazil. They are missionary churches. They go elsewhere. They probably have more missions than Presbyterian Church USA does, I think.
They actually send missionaries here to
Absolutely.
to the United States.
Yeah, send them everywhere. So if you want the center of Presbyterianism in America right now, you might pick Korea while we're on top. I don't know that that's irremediably tragic by any stretch of the imagination. If you've been in Scotland, you know it's a nice place, but it's not the center of the universe. And once in a while, people need to be reminded of that. So that's good. Now, in terms of the history here, what are some of the things we can say in the 16th century? One is that the Reformation is a time where relations between church and state teeter. One of the big things to understand is the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, is not just about religion. It's also about politics, and they are intertwined. Why are they intertwined? They're intertwined in part because in the medieval period, the political order of society is hooked together with the church in Rome. So, for example, we will see here shortly that there are bishops who have armies and enter into Geneva for different purposes. Now, you probably don't know too many bishops today who have armies, but things change. And you've got a kind of way in which these things interpenetrate. The other thing you have is you have Roman Catholicism and its hierarchical structures are legitimating princes, telling you which princes are okay, which kings are okay, and so forth. If you think of the history of England, with Henry VIII, in addition to having all those wives and killing so many women, he also breaks with Rome, right? And gets you the Church of England. Now, the break with Rome and the beginning of the Church of England are closely integrated things. Don't get the impression that the Church of England was simply a political idea. That's not true. Thomas Cranmer and others are interested in a variety of things, but the king is interested primarily in political independence from Rome. That's what he's interested in. Now you'll see that pattern show up some more here. Why is there a kind of a problem here? Well, the deeper problem probably is this. The medieval Europe is a landlord civilization. That is, it's dominated by groups of people, princes, kings, dukes, and so forth, who have massive landed estates that are given to them and are established in a political order. So if you can think of a place like North Carolina covered by maybe 3 or 4 estates, that's the whole thing. You'll have the picture. Now, if you really want to see that, you can talk about early Virginia almost, you know. But they are bigger than that, and they are politically established. So they're landlords, and they have a monopoly of agriculture. Real simple stuff. You don't have to think about it too long. So they have a monopoly when it comes to agriculture. Who are peasants? Peasants are essentially people who own no land and work on these landed holdings. They are sharecroppers. Right? The way they pay things off is they give a share of their crop to whatever the political authority is. Think Sheriff of Nottingham or something like that, if you ever saw a Robin Hood movie, something along those lines. Now, when that happens, it turns out, this becomes not a big surprise, I expect, that the people who own the large swatches of land don't treat the peasants particularly well. And the shares increase, and there are difficulties. So you've got an oppressed agricultural working class of sharecroppers called peasants, and they're hanging around, and they resent this act. So that's one. And you will see a number of things happen. For example, the Waldensians in Italy in the 13th century are an early Protestant movement that's centered around a guy named Waldo who wants to preach in the vernacular language and translate the Bible so that regular people can read it. See? And he's also interested in a church community that holds together and follows certain rules and is different from the dominant culture. For his troubles, he is executed, but he does begin something called the Waldensian movement. In Italy today, in Rome, there is something called Facoltà Valdese, which is a seminary in Rome. It is a Waldensian seminary. It's very nicely located, right by the Tiber River, not too far from the Vatican. You would love going there. It's really great. You will notice if you drive west on Route 40, you'll drive past a town and one of the exits called Valdese. That's Valdese, is what it really is. And it means that Waldensians moved there at a certain point. And so we've got some descendants of Waldensians up there off of Route 40. Right? They have some wine, which in my opinion is not all that great, but that's another matter. It fits in part because they import the grapes from New York. Why would an Italian do that? It's not something that a guy like me with a name like Ottati can possibly understand. There are better grapes available in northern New York. I mean, everybody knows that, right? Manischewitz from there. Questionable champagne. But so you've got them in Valdese. So you've got agricultural monopolies that oppress peasants. They also limit commerce in the cities. They are interested in setting prices that they regard as appropriate, and they don't let the prices fluctuate with the market. Right? This is to their advantage because it means they can get goods. And to whose disadvantage is it? An emerging mercantile class, merchants and so forth. It's not for their advantage. They also insist that charging money of interest is usury and should be prohibited. It's a questionable exegetical read in some respects. We can go into that. But in any case, they only allow Jews to charge interest on money. So you have a number of Jewish populations involved in banking that has its own little history of things. And then what they do is they suppress markets, say, in ways that limit commerce. And so you've got merchants in cities that don't like that. So now we've got two groups, right, that are feeling a little low and mean in this setup. One is peasants, sharecroppers, and the other is merchants in cities. So we've got that third thing we have is we've got political groups, officers, princes and so forth. Some of them want to be independent of some other things. So you put that together, it's a pretty volatile political situation. There are peasant uprisings and revolts. They say you could have something like that with Ventions. In the 16th century, Thomas Munzer preaches against princes. He preaches in favor of church reform and divine interventions to change the government. He leads peasants against armies of princes in 1525. They go into the open field with biblical banners and stuff, sometimes a little bit like the ones we might have at church, kind of, see? And they go to fight these prepared armies, and they get the tar kicked out of them. And he gets captured, he's tortured, he gives some kind of confession, and he's executed in 1525. I'll tell you, Reformation, you want to be a religious leader during the Reformation, you just got to understand it's a hazardous profession. Okay. So we have that. Luther, in that same year, writes a tract called Against the Robbing and Murdering Towards Peasants. Now, he wrote that thing before the massacre, but nevertheless, you can see the general direction of it. The direction of it is Luther does not like the peasants' revolts, in part because Luther is aligned with certain princes in Bavaria who are interested in being independent of Rome, so he doesn't want simply revolts against princes. So that's one. Another thing you have are urban politics shaped by merchants in a number of different places. Earlier on, for example, Savonarola, the Dominican friar, advocates Republican reforms in Florence after the Medici are deposed for a while. Then they come back. The Medici are well connected with Rome. So he supports citizens holding office. He wants to have a council govern the city. It's a pretty typical move from the time period. He wants to say that's not the same thing as mob rule, because mob rule is simply direct. So this is you elect representatives. They're on a council, and the council governs. Now, who elects? The people who elect are citizens. Ordinarily, that means for men who have some standing economically. But it's not the same thing as saying princes and kings. It's not the same thing as the Medici, who understandably are not favorably inclined. What happens to Savonarola? Savonarola is, in fact, imprisoned, hanged, and burned, just to be double sure, on the 23rd of May, 1498. So Savonarola is an important figure that way in terms of urban stuff. Munzer is an important figure in terms of peasants' revolts. If you want to read a couple of very positive reviews of Thomas Munzer, you can read some Marxists on that. They're very pleased because it's regarded as a proletarian revolt. They're not entirely wrong about that. It seems to me they're not entirely wrong in admiring some of his qualities. There are some other, how should we say, a certain lack of prudence that perhaps is not often there. Going to the field with a bunch of religious banners and expect to defeat armies is perhaps a little out there, but okay. We have then Geneva, which is where Geneva, remember, that's where this reform movement is going to be and be situated in this way. The first commune in Geneva is in 1285. Now, a commune means it's a group of citizens who can vote on stuff. That's what it means, all right? That doesn't mean like when I was in college. It doesn't mean that. Although they could have voting too, so it might qualify. But the use of the word commune today is a little different than what they're talking about here. They have common responsibility for the city as a government. There are various councils that are established from 1502 and following. And every time you establish a council, it's a political movement, it can get you into trouble. For example, it turns out that the Bishop of Savoy goes into Geneva at a certain point after one of these tribunals is set up, marches with 500 troops where the leader of the council is and hangs them. Okay, this is part of the fun. You just want to see what kind of a time period we got here. And what happens is that finally, the city of Geneva is in alliances with certain other Swiss cities, primarily Bern, which is the strongest one. And it gains what you and I might call political independence, but by fits and starts. When there is a new tribunal in 1529, that one sticks because the Swiss alliance holds over against the Duke of Savoy. That's what's going on. So there are signs of Lutheranism, so-called, by 1532. That is Protestants infiltrating and showing up. They're showing up because it's an independent city and it's not run by bishops. All right, by 1536, Calvin arrives. Calvin arrives as a refugee in Geneva, a French refugee, a humanist scholar, and someone who is for the cause of the reform. And he's in Geneva primarily. There's bits and starts because Geneva is one of the Swiss cities where someone can be a refugee from Catholicism in France and be okay. That's what he's doing there. He is not a citizen of Geneva. He is a refugee and an immigrant. So Reformed pastors at Geneva, the ones that he collects there and run the church with him, are primarily French-speaking, humanist-trained pastors. They are in a city that is primarily German-speaking and mercantile. It's a city that has some significance, but it doesn't have a major educational institution. He is going to try and devise one at the College of Geneva with some success, but it does not yet happen. Geneva then becomes kind of reformed center. Now let's just we'll talk about some theological themes here for this group. One is something called calling and vocation. The idea is that you and I, as regular people in the world, stand in multiple lines of responsibility in family life, right? Employment, citizenship, so forth. So if we take a person, we can say there's a footprint of their responsibilities. And these can become callings through which you serve God. It's the Protestant idea. You don't have to go to a monastery to do that. You can do that in and through. Right? It's what we might call ordinary life. So, for instance, this is a period of time in which it is a radical act to be in favor of clerical marriages, meaning that someone who is a priest or a monk can marry a nun. Luther does that. And you want to try something countercultural sometime, get in your time machine, go back to Luther's period of time, become a monk, and marry a nun. Tell me how it goes. It'll be real interesting, but it is a countercultural movement at this point. The idea is that you're going to lead an ordinary life in family and stuff, rather than be separated out to other institutions of the world. So Luther does that. He has the idea that you can be a Christ to the neighbor in and through your ordinary responsibilities. Like what? You take a person and you can just do a little footprint of their responsibilities and callings. So I don't presume on anyone. We'll just take Professor Sampson. Professor Sampson is a father. He is a son. He is a spouse. He is employed by Davidson College, and he's a citizen of the United States of America. He's a Reformed minister. Okay, that's 6. Now, there's probably some other ones. Now, the nice little question is, how's he going to balance all that? Right? And how can you serve God and neighbor, be a Christ to the neighbor in the middle of all that stuff? If you've ever been to a committee meeting at the college, you will recognize that it's not all so easy. Okay, and that's probably true in other organizations too. So you get the idea there is people have multiple callings. Callings and vocations are not only remunerative employment. They are also things like being a father, son, citizen. Last time I looked, almost no one's being paid for being a father. Some people may benefit from being a son, who knows, financially, but it's not employment, see? It can be employment, it's not that. Now so we could take anyone and just come up with that kind of footprint. The footprint is of several responsibilities. The question is, how do you serve God and neighbor within that footprint? That's a kind of Protestant question, as opposed to how do you become a member of a group that leaves the world to do something else. Calvin also puts forward what we could call a Christian humanism. He thinks that the classical philosophers are right to say that know thyself is an important practical matter. It's easy to tell why it's a practical matter. You will be in many circumstances and lines of responsibility in your life. They will differ, and there'll be a lot of different things you need to know, but you will always be there. So if you know yourself, that's a leg up on trying to figure out what to do in these different circumstances. Huh? So know yourself, he thinks they're right about that. Then he thinks is in order to know yourself truly, you need to know yourself in relation to God. So you've got two power imperatives for Calvin, rather than the one for the Greek philosophers. Know thyself, know God, and put them together to be accurate. If you do that, what you will understand, he thinks, is that people are good creatures. They are chronically corrupted, fall short of things, again and again and again. That's sin. And they are beneficiaries of grace and redemption. They have new possibilities. Three things at once. Again, walk, chew gum, and I don't know, look up at the same time. Three things at once. Good creatures, chronically corrupted, grace with possibilities. That's the three things. Now, if you think about that, that will mean that, you never want to give all the power to any one person in any organization. Why? That's the middle part. Chronically corrupted, right? So you don't trust anyone with all the power, including yourself, if you can get that far, huh? It's not easy to do. You may wonder why there's always a prayer during the offering. There's a prayer of confession in a worship service and Presbyterians. And this is why. You want to start with a principle of self-criticism. That's really important if you want to operate with integrity in the world. It's not just everyone else who has a problem, right? You all got it. All right, so what's that going to mean? That's going to mean that something like family life, you don't just give all the power to one person. So to have a terrible example of this in my family, when our kids were at home and so forth, maybe there was a big decision to be made. I noticed that they never let me alone in a room to make the decision by myself. They think the reason was that even though I am almost universally thought to be a really nice guy, they didn't trust me necessarily to uphold all their interests. So they were there advocating. Fair enough, see? Years ago, when I was teaching in seminary for a number of years, faculty meetings, family meetings not my favorite thing to do. Either really you feel like your whole life passes before your eyes with no real purpose, and you're in there. But I went to every one of those because I don't want to let those guys by themselves do it. And you know, here's the really interesting thing. I was never the only person there. I don't know what to do. Don't give all the power to any one person. Huh? Checks and balances, representative structures. Okay. So that follows from that. The other thing that we have here is what you can call a hopeful realism. Sin is radical and universal. Things are tough, but there are possibilities to make things better. Last part of this is you care about arts and sciences. Calvin is going to claim that the arts and sciences are gifts of God, and they are ways in which you develop God's given capacities that God gives you. So it's a matter of moral importance that you care about them as well. So he's a big booster of freedom of inquiry. He thinks you ought to read secular writers, by which he means Cicero and stuff like that. He could not have known that in these latter days, some few sullen minds would think that was a bad idea. He didn't. So he's a humanist and a Protestant at the same time. John Calvin, here you go. Right? And you care about the science because you're studying God's world. No better thing you can do. All right, so you've got that kind of stuff there. Calvin on civil government, which is where I wanted to get here finally. You want to remember his circumstance in the Genevan city state. You can compare it to, for instance, Luther's circumstance where he's aligned with a prince. It's a different circumstance. So Calvinism, a city-state, has gained its independence from the medieval hierarchy, and as a council where citizens vote. He wants to claim that God's government of the world is twofold, it's spiritual and civil. The chief task of civil government, he says, is to provide a public manifestation of religion among Christians and provide that humanity is maintained among men. But the first part is to support true religion. This is a theocracy of sorts, although it's not monolithic. There are some checks and balances there. The second part there, maintain humanity among men or people, means that you have moral grounds for laws and government. So government's supposed to allow for true religion and maintain humanity among people. Two major sorts of tasks. You need, when you're talking about government, he says to avoid two extremes. One is to overturn needed order. You need to have order and structures. You need to have some powers that are exercised in order to have those structures. He doesn't trust people apart from all structures. Sorry. The other thing you want to avoid is what he calls the flattering of princes, or, quote, immoderately praising their power. I'm supposed to do that. There are three parts of government. There are office holders, there are laws that guide, and there are people who are governed. Government office is for him a legitimate and high calling. Not like some Protestant groups who thought you shouldn't participate in civil government at all. Some Mennonites and so-called left-wing Reformation. He's not for that. He thinks you should participate. Government office is a legitimate high calling by which we may serve God and man. Now you know why there's a lot of Presbyterian lawyers and politicians. It's supposed to be the way to serve God and man. Other thing you want to say is that if you are a government officer, you are God's minister. Since you're God's minister, you better do the right stuff. He's going to ask, with what hand will they sign wicked decrees? Which hand is supposed to be an instrument of God's will? You have an office now in relation to God and others. Don't screw it up. All right, that's what he's saying. So two things here. He says there are that government officers can wield coercive power for taxation. You will notice on April 15th, or whichever day it's going to be this year, the government does not call up and say, would you like to pay your taxes? I mean, that's not what goes on. Everyone knows that, right? We're okay. That's coercive power. And then coercive power for policing. He thinks you need that. And he thinks you need coercive power for what he thinks of as lawful wars of defense that are conducted with restraint command or torture. He thinks there are three forms of government. He's a classical guy. It's the kind of stuff you will have gotten in some sort of philosophy class a long time ago or Western civilization class. The three forms are monarchy, aristocracy or government by a group, and democracy, which is demos, which is everybody governs all at once. Like, see, like, that's what they think. Now, what he's going to claim is that there are different circumstances, so not every place has the same form. But what he favors is a system of aristocracy compounded with democracy, or democracy compounded with aristocracy, by which he means that the people elect a group that governs. People do not vote directly on every piece of legislation. They do not vote directly on every policy, but they vote directly for representatives who in turn, okay? It's what you and I call representative democracy. So that's what he's for. Why is he for it? He's for it because he thinks there are certain problems with the alternatives. He thinks that direct popular rule can lead to chaos and the unrestrained rule of the larger group. Immediately. Now look at it. People are nice when you're having dinner with them, but they're not always nice. And there are different groups out there. Okay? A kid from New Jersey like me knows this. Italian name from New Jersey. Do I know there are different groups? I guess I know there are different groups. And you should know there are, particularly in the current American climate. say, well, this is yeah, come on. So you don't want direct popular rule. On the other hand, there's problems. But he also thinks you got to look out for kings and princes. Why? Put too much power against. And when you do that, he says that it is very rare for kings so to control themselves that their will never disagrees with what is right and just. Okay, they're a little more. They have their own objectives. They stick to those objectives, even when those objectives are not right and not just. And it is also rare for them to have been endowed with such great keenness and prudence that each knows how much is enough. They're also a little stupid. They're also not entirely prudent. They overreach with their power and they do something stupid, and then everyone is in difficulty. See? This is his portrait of too much power in a single leader. It could be true of politicians and other groups too, right? Watch out. They're going to confuse their will with what's moral. One. Watch out. They're not going to know how to restrain themselves and be prudent. That's two. There's going to be feeling it. I got power. You don't know anyone like that in contemporary politics, so I'm not even going to try. I would say laws then are set forth in constitutions that vary according to social conditions, but they're based on a general sense of equity or justice. So, for example, general sense of equity or justice says you shouldn't steal. This, he thinks, is a virtually universal idea. You shouldn't steal. No known society, incidentally, that thinks stealing what is regarded as legitimate property is a good idea. It does not exist. There are disagreements over what constitutes legitimate personal property. That's true. So, do not steal. Now let's take another one. No insider trading. It's a form of do not steal. But it's a form of do not steal that only can be devised in certain contexts. You have to have corporate structures and markets and investors in order to have no insider trading. Most civilizations in the world did not have the rule no insider trading, but they all had do not steal because they didn't have the financial markets. Simple. Okay. So a constitution has to develop a lot of laws that are supposed to be fair and just, but they're more particular and they're more developed. We can criticize actual laws by the moral standards of justice. That is open to you to do. But actual laws do not simply repeat general moral sentiments or ideas. They're more particular. They have to upgrade the context. Criticize, but it's not simply direct morality. First duty of the people is to obey, even when duly constituted officials are bad. He's got some biblical examples about that, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. If an ordinance or policy requires amendment, people should commit the matter to officials. You shouldn't immediately just try and overthrow it. But rulers have no free pass for power. One, God may raise up unwitting agents, like when Assyria invades Israel, to punish Israel for God's will. And the unwitting agents may have purposes that do not accord with God's moral will, but they're there to punish tyrants. Two, God can raise up what he calls open avengers from among his servants and arm them with God's command to punish the wicked government and deliver people unjustly oppressed. This example, Moses. That's possible. And then three, government officers who have been commissioned by a constitution that have a moral duty to defend the public good may, quote, restrain the willfulness of princes and kings as they do their job. So if you're a government officer, you can disobey higher authority princes and kings. So there is a sort of breakdown of this thing for him. I want to say that not surprisingly, Calvin's contemporaries and later generations of Reformed leaders have found reasons to participate in political revolutions in a bunch of places. They have tried to help form representative structures and assemblies for government that do not allow absolute power to reside in the elected executive, representative assemblies, the judiciary, or even the popular majority. They all have different purviews, and they just have to fight it out. See? It is not the case, according to Calvin, that all judicial decisions should simply reflect the majority's popular opinion. Are you kidding me? What would you get there? Hey, want to try and pass a Civil Rights Act that in 1960s? Then we've got also then the idea that they are going to frame ideas of citizenship and principled civil disobedience. So that's all I wanted to say about the beginning of this. It's a kind of revolutionary movement in a way. It's got a theology. The theology is important. It is hatched in conjunction with certain circumstances in Europe. I'm trying to answer any questions about this if I can. You know, my wife says I just go upstairs and make it up, she used to say. And now she can't say it because my study's on the first floor. We have to own it, preventing there. Okay. How we go? You've got a tradition here that could be characterized as worldly Christianity. That would be a fair thing to say. It doesn't mean you should simply compromise with it. You're supposed to try and change it. You're supposed to participate in it. You can take a service like the one we ordinarily have here and see certain elements of that. Prayer of confession. Start with a principle of self-criticism. This is after you start off with a hymn of praise. That's the good preacher doing what the good preacher is created to do. It's a happy moment. Then a call to confession. Sin, sin, sin. You also talk about grace. Then you have assurance of pardon. If you get real lucky sometime, they'll also read the law or a summary of the law. After that, that's where you're supposed to read it in the reform service of worship. And that means you commit yourself to moral standards after you've been self-critical. Moral standards are not very condemning, they're very guiding. Then you pass the peace. Everyone likes to do that these days. It used to be shake hands. Yeah. Yes.
So, yeah, I've been a part of a lot of churches, but I've never been one that read the law after the affirmation. Where did that kind of stuff happen and what stream did it?
Stopped happening, I think, mostly with some stuff in the United Presbyterian Church for the time. Some time ago. It was something that Calvin wanted to joy to sing the law. And so forth. The idea was that the law does not condemn, the law guides. It's your joy and your delight. When Israel gets the 10 Commandments, this is not to oppress them. This is to make it possible for them to have a good life together rather than be slaves. The law is a good thing. The law is my joy and my delight, is a quote from Psalm 119. The law is not meant to oppress you. When you see lists of the 10 Commandments, like in Texas, done in stone or something by the state capitol, that start with, "You shall have no other gods before me," you can thank them very much, but they do not start with 10 Commandments. So they're supposed to start. They're supposed to start with, "I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, a house of oppression and land of Egypt." They start with an act of grace that constitutes a people, and that's why the commandments are there. This has been a long time forgotten. And so you have that kind of problem. I think also in this country, people are afraid that somehow laws are going to get there or something like that. Moral movements are going to be difficult. But you see, that's not the way it's understood. It's understood as a down payment on a good life together, a lucky thing to have. Then you shake hands as a community, not because you're a particularly good community. Who's that? That's a symbolic act of possibility. You will recognize that half the people you shake hands with, you're not even sure who all their kids are. So let's quit kidding ourselves about our completely perfect community. That's not good. Then after that, we go into sermon, scripture, and so forth. It is always fall short, but you have certain times. Grace. Yeah. Grace first, also. Yeah.
So what does that look like?
If you were to put it where?
We were put the summary of the law in the book.
Oh, it would go after the assurance of pardon and before the passing of the peace. That's where it would go. And it could be, you could read all the 10 Commandments if you want, but you could do something like Look not to your own interest, but to the interest of others, summary of the law, out of Philippians, or just take your choice. But that's where it would go. And then after that, you would pass the peace. It would come after the assurance of pardon. When you read it after the assurance of pardon, you understand the law can't come get you in. They just told you that by the grace of God, everything's okay. Now you don't read the law before assurance of pardon. You don't read the law before prayer of confession. Could, but this primary place is after the assurance of pardon. The law is an expression of grace. See, it's after all a good thing to know that you shouldn't kill. And it's after all a good thing to try and be honest in the court of law, do not bear false witness. It's after all a good thing trying to be faithful in family relationship. No one's going to come get you over it. So that's one of the big things. And it's characteristic of this tradition. Moral norms make a difference. But the center of the thing is the grace of God. Right? You don't want to emphasize the grace of God and let the moral norms go away. You don't want to emphasize the moral norms and the grace of God. That doesn't make any sense either. That would be like the thing on the Texas, Capitol grounds. Just start with no gospel for me. Well, thanks a bunch. This is excuse me on this, but is one of the reasons I think why you never want state legislators to help you out too much with your religious tradition, because they'll blow it sky high. I mean, what else would they do right? And now you're going to hand over the religious tradition to them, and look what you're going to do. I'm trying to bring up a bunch of Christians at the Presbyterians at my house. They're starting the 10 Commandments with no gospel for me. Thanks. How am I supposed to do this? I'm supposed to tell my kids the whole point of the religion is to have laws that scare you. Anyway, laws, not bad things. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to get rid of it. So what we'll do, next time we have Dave True here talking about confessing Christ in Nazi Germany. It'd be pretty interesting stuff, really, I think. One question is, where do you draw the line? Right? What is the big point? What are you going to resist? Where's the problem? He will try and point that out to you, and the Barmen Declaration has a way of doing that. Barmen Declaration is not a church confession. It's in the Book of Confessions. It is a declaration meant to be affirmed by churches that had different confessions. It's supposed to be a common core under pressures of Nazism. Pretty typical, however, that some Reformed churches are not going to play ball. But what are they going to be worried about? Too much power in one place? No separation of church and state. That's really going to get it, because what's going to happen is the Nazi regime is going to try to enact something called the Aryan paragraph that disallows people who are Jewish from joining Christian churches, and that's it. At that point, this group says, sorry, you can't tell us to be members of these churches. You'll see that kind of stuff. It's not always involved in political controversy, but it's very often involved in political controversy. Not really just because it cares about life in the world, but if you think about it, the world is a tolerably political place. And there are a lot of differences. Try from the Civil War in this country. That's its own place. All right, well, thanks very much.